Hi everyone, welcome. We need to talk about Pete Best. Now Pete Best was one of the original drummers of the Beatles, and I'll explain a little more about that in a moment. Pete was recruited just before the Hamburg residency, but was replaced by Ringo Starr just prior to their big breakthrough. Now his tenure with the band started just as the Quarrymen were about to cease to exist. I really must put together a video on the Quarrymen. But essentially, the Quarrymen gradually evolved into the Beatles, with John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison as the core members. The transformation occurred over several years, and the specific moment that the Quarrymen officially became the Beatles is generally considered to be in August 1960. Now here's a brief timeline. From 1956 to 59, the Quarrymen featured John, Paul and George, as well as a few others, and went through various lineup changes and included temporary drummers like Tommy Moore, Norman Chapman and Colin Hanton. You can see my video on Johnny Gentle and the Silver Beatles here. During 1959, Stuart Sutcliffe joined the band as the bassist, and they briefly adopted the name Johnny and the Moondogs. In August 1960, the band consisted of John, Paul, George, Stuart and their new drummer Pete Best, officially adopted the name The Beatles just before their trip to Hamburg. So, by August 1960, the Quarrymen essentially ceased to exist, and the Beatles emerged as the new identity for the band, with the original classic lineup of John, Paul, George, Stuart and Pete. Now Stuart Sutcliffe left the band in 1961, and the final iconic lineup of John, Paul, George and Ringo was solidified in 1962 after Pete Best was replaced by Ringo. By 1960, the Beatles, now consisting of John, Paul, George and Stuart Sutcliffe, who was on bass, were in need of a permanent drummer. The decision to audition for a drummer and subsequently Pete Best's recruitment was largely influenced by their upcoming engagement at the Kaiserkeller in Hamburg. Now at the time, the band was managed by Alan Williams. Pete Best, who was known in the Liverpool music scene for his drumming skills, was suggested by Mona Best, who was the owner of the Casbah Coffee Club and of course Pete's mother. So Alan Williams arranged for Pete Best to audition for the Beatles, and his energetic drumming style seemed to be a good fit for the band's evolving sound. Therefore, Pete Best was invited to join the Beatles just before they embarked on their historic Hamburg residency in 1960. And this marked the beginning of his tenure with the band. And I've often wondered if, out of desperation, the Beatles simply chose Pete because they needed to fulfill the Hamburg contract. That being said, of course, I haven't found any information on any other auditionees other than Pete Best, so maybe he was the only one, and so the others in the band just agreed to let him in. If you know, drop me a comment. Of course, there was one other drummer on the scene during the late 50s and early 60s, but he was already part of the music scene with a prominent Liverpool band called, wait for it, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And this band would also play in Hamburg, but we'll get to that in a minute. So finally, from 1960 to 1962, Pete Best officially joined the Beatles as their drummer just before the Hamburg residency, and he played a significant role in shaping the band's sound during those early years. Now let's talk about the legendary Mona Best's Basement Cafe, which was a pivotal spot in the Beatles' early history. The club became the hub of Liverpool's music scene, and it was here that the Beatles honed their skills, playing night after night to enthusiastic audiences. The Casbah eventually gave many of the Liverpool bands their start, including the Beatles. Pete's solid drumming provided the backbone to the band's energetic performances, earning them a growing fan base. Because his mother ran the club in their family home, Pete Best knew just about everyone his age in Liverpool. His home was a happening spot on Friday and Saturday nights, and the Quarrymen were perhaps the original Casbah house band when it opened in the summer of 1959. That's how Paul, George and John came to know Pete Best in the first place. Pete had received a drum kit for Christmas in 1959, and in the summer of 1960, when Lennon and the others desperately needed a drummer, if they wanted to take advantage of an opportunity to play in Germany, they thought of Pete. So although I mentioned earlier that they auditioned him to join the band, I've also read that they didn't care how good he was. They just knew that he had a drum kit, and all they had to do was talk him into going to Hamburg with them. Now, the internet is a funny place, isn't it? Filled with all sorts of dubious information. One story or another, though, Pete was in, and to Hamburg they would go. Anyway, Pete Best and Ringo Starr would know each other well, since Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were also a band that played at the Casbah, as well as the Liverpool circuit, right? Now here's an interesting snippet of information for you. Ringo Starr played drums live for the Beatles from 62 to 66, but the shows were usually less than 30 minutes. Pete Best was the drummer for the Beatles for just over 2 years, from 1960 to 62. Because the group played 6 days a week, 8 hours a night, when he was drumming in Germany, Pete likely spent more time actually performing live on stage with the Beatles during his career than Ringo did in his. So Mona Best's Casbah, and of course the connection to her son with Pete, and him joining the band, played an integral part of Pete Best's story with the band. The Casbah has some heritage status too. In 2006, Cultural Minister David Lammy announced that the Best's ex-coal cellar was to be given Grade 2 listed building status and a blue plaque after becoming recommended by the English Heritage. It has been opened as a tourist attraction in Liverpool, along with McCartney and Lennon's previous homes, Fourth Lynn Road, Menlove Avenue, right? And now the club is 3.5 miles from the Liverpool city centre, and only booked groups of visitors are accepted. Paul McCartney has been quoted as saying, "I think it's a good idea to let people know about the Casbah. They know about the cavern, they know about some of those things, but the Casbah was the place where it all started. We helped paint it and stuff. We looked upon it as our personal club." English Heritage's head of heritage protection in the north of England, Bob Hawkins, stated, "The basement Casbah club rooms are historically significant because they represent tangible evidence of the Beatles' formation, their growth in popularity and their enduring cultural influence throughout the world. The club survives in a remarkably well-preserved condition since its closure in 1962, with wall and ceiling paintings of spiders, dragons, rainbows and stars by original band members, along with 1960s musical equipment, amplifiers and original chairs. We know of no other survival like it in Liverpool or indeed anywhere else." As the Beatles' popularity soared, so did tensions within the band. In 1962, just before recording their first single, the decision was made to replace Pete Best with Ringo Starr. It was a heartbreaking moment for Pete, who learned of his dismissal just as the band was on the cusp of fame, and that was from the mouth of Brian Epstein, who was left with the task of sacking Pete. Now, I got this quote from Beatles Bible website, and I'll leave a link in the description below for using it in my video, right? Credit where credit's due. "Neil drove me into town and dropped me off at Whitechapel. I found Brian in a very uneasy mood when I joined him in his upstairs office. He came out with a lot of pleasantries and talked anything but business, which was unlike him. These were obviously delaying tactics, and something important I knew was on his mind. Then he mustered enough courage to drop the bombshell. 'The boys want you out and Ringo in.' I was stunned and found words difficult. Only one echoed through my mind. Why? 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 'They don't think you're a good enough drummer, Pete,' Brian went on. And George Martin doesn't think you're a good enough drummer. I consider myself as good, if not better than Ringo, I could hear myself saying. Then I asked, does Ringo know about this yet? He's joining on Saturday, Epi said. So everything was neatly packaged. A conspiracy had clearly been going on for some time behind my back. But not one of the other Beatles could find the courage to tell me. The stab in the back had been left to Brian, and it had been left until the last minute. Even Ringo had been party to it, someone else I considered to be a pal until this momentous day. Epstein went on to what for him was simply next business at this shattering meeting. There are still a couple of venues left before Ringo joins. Will you play? Yes, I nodded, not really knowing what I was saying, for my mind was in a turmoil. How could this happen to me? Why had it taken 2 years for John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison to decide that my drumming was not of a high standard for them? Dazed, I made my way out of Brian's office. Downstairs, Neil was waiting for me. What's happened? He asked as soon as he saw me. You look as if you've seen a ghost. Now here's a question for you. There's much talk about his drumming techniques, things like he could give a solid backbeat, but was unable to grow as a musician enough to keep up with the growing talents of the other three. And there's much written about Pete Best that he was a bit of a loner and he didn't join in the camaraderie of the other three. But, and here's the question, if George Martin was prepared to give the Beatles a recording contract and had been impressed with all 4 Beatles, would Pete Best have been sacked? Was it George Martin's thoughts on Pete Best's abilities that forced their hand? Record contract versus Pete Best. It's a bit of a butterfly effect, isn't it? You can't discount anything that happened prior to their big break because it made the Beatles who they are. Pete Best was the drummer that was there during the grunt work club days that made the Beatles as great as they were. And we may never know what personal contributions he made to them as people. Even Ringo's greatest strength to the Beatles was being the heart of the band. He was a great drummer, but he theoretically could have been replaced on the drums. The Beatles would have musically been just as good with another talented drummer. Andy White comes to mind, the session drummer for Love Me Do, and Jimmy Nicol, for their Australian tour. It kind of proved that point. But as a band, they would likely have dissolved sooner without Ringo. With the 3 egos and talents of John, Paul and George, he was always the one the others would turn to. He was the everyone's friend, the guy you talk to off the ledge when everyone else is pissing you off. And that person is so important in the group dynamic, and no one in that group did that better than Ringo. So another question, could Pete Best have been a Ringo? Not as a drummer, but as everyone's friend, in the band? Probably not. Ringo was unquestionably a better drummer than Pete Best. And that, plus Best's general uninterest in the other band members and his tendency not to blend in with them, meant that the band seized on Martin's lack of respect for his drumming as a pretext to firing him. History suggests that they made the right choice. What happened then to Pete Best after leaving the Beatles? Well, he continued to pursue his passion for music, and he formed his own band, the Pete Best Combo. Although the group achieved some success, it was clear that Pete would forever be associated with his time in the Beatles. Over the years, he embraced his place in history, participating in Beatles-related events, and even releasing his own solo albums. He allegedly attempted suicide in '65. He went on to work as a civil servant, and he also found a new career appearing in Beatles-related events such as conventions, where he sometimes would play drums. He's never spoken to any of the Beatles since he was forced out of the band, and reparation of sorts came in 1995 when Aspinall called him to discuss the Beatles anthology, which was to include some tracks featuring Pete's drumming, for which he would be paid royalties. Now, Pete said of the release, 7 out of 60 tracks was quite a lot, and I'd like to think that that amount of tracks over a short period of time it showed the important role I played. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. How much did he get in royalties? It wasn't far short of $1 million. The money was welcome, even if, as he says, he was well set at that stage in his life, having made a good living from being Pete Best of the Beatles and Pete Best the musician in his own right. Lennon and Harrison are dead now, and Starr had nothing to do with the decision to replace the drummer. So there's only one Beatle left who was directly involved in the banishing of Pete Best. When asked in an interview for the Irish Times if he forgives McCartney, I've nothing to forgive him about. They made a decision as young men which was safeguarding their future. Okay, it could have been handled better. I was the fall guy for it. I suffered, but I'm not holding them to task over it. If I'd been in the same situation and I was another member of the band, maybe I'd have been one of the bad guys. There you have it. Pete Best, the Beatles' original drummer. His contributions to the early Beatles sound are undeniable, and though his time with the band was short-lived, Pete Best remains a crucial part of rock and roll and Beatle history. So thanks for watching. I think I'm off to do some more digging about for another video or two. Bye for now.